Kathy called me at 6:30 and proceed there.
6:30, so, okay, so there you go.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Bill Wilson, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the October meeting of the Devil's Gate History Club. We have a very special program tonight, and in a moment I'll ask Pauline Wolf to introduce our speaker. But first I have my usual announcement about the donation can in the back of the room, and we really appreciate your contributions to help support this group. Also back there on the green sheets of paper is the program for 2000-2001 for the Devil's Gate History Club. So if you have not gotten one from previous meetings, feel free to take one tonight. And if we run out, let me know if you want one, and I'll be sure you get one. Next month, to advise you about that, is a program called The Anecdotal History of the Theater in Georgetown. And it'll be given by John Calhoun of Silverplume here in this room at 7 o'clock on the third Friday, November 17th. And as usual, we'll have no meeting in December. And in January, we will meet in the Masonic Hall. That's January 19th. And our speaker will be Georgiana Contiguglia, who is the president of Colorado Historical Society. So that should be a very interesting program for us. So, Pauline Wolf, would you please come up and introduce our speaker for this evening? Thank you.
Bill Wilson introduces me, so I can introduce Polly. I think I'm the middle person here and probably am most unneeded, but this evening we're fortunate to have Polly Chandler as our speaker. Though she needs no introduction, for those of you unaware of her background, Polly was born in Virginia. She came out to Colorado with her family in the 1920s. The Chandler family purchased the Red Ram building, out of which they operated a confectionery. Polly attended 12 grades of school in the old red schoolhouse on Taos Street, now owned by Bernard Buckley. Upon graduation, she received a full tuition scholarship at the University of Denver, where she earned a bachelor's degree. After marriage, Polly and her two sons and her doctor husband spent some time in Europe, courtesy of the U.S. Army. Following her return to this country, Polly came back home to Georgetown. She began writing. During the 1960s and 70s, she was a frequent contributor to the Denver Post and was published in national magazines such as Women's Day. For 18 years, she was a feature columnist for the Clear Creek Mining Journal. 3 of her books on Georgetown and its people and history have been published. Her writing has won awards from the Colorado Authors League and from the Denver Women's Press Club. In 1971, Polly opened her bookstore in the stone building in Taos Square. She has relocated several times, but her loyal customers have followed her each time to her present location on Rose Street. This evening, Polly will read from her work. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our mutual friend, Polly Chandler.
I want to tell you, I don't know what I'm going to have to live up to because I couldn't hear a word Pauline said. I'm finally in the process of getting some hearing aids after all these generations, and they're both back being fixed or altered or something. So I don't know what you said, Pauline.
It was all good.
I also want to tell you that I'm terrified I told Bill if I'd known he was going to do this, I would not have been here tonight. He slipped this in on me. So, see if I can get along without my glasses. I want to tell you before I start this is kind of wobbly, so. See, I'm messing up already. I knew it would happen. Put that up there. I have a cough drop in my mouth on account of a tickle. I see so many new faces here, people that I don't know. I've been out of circulation for about 3 years, playing sick with a hip and so on. And there are a lot of new people here that I don't know. I hope we can remedy that. I used to enjoy being part of the audience when this first started, but it wasn't to be right then. It's so nice to be here tonight, and I hope you'll bear with my terror. See, I have my cough drop. You're going to find out you haven't the most accomplished speaker in the world here. Mr. Wilson, when he asked me about this, we were talking about, can you folks hear me? All right. About some of the old characters that I grew up with here, used to know, and I'm very sorry if any of you were at the Friends of the Library luncheon about 6 or 7 years ago when I did somewhat the same thing. I hope it won't be too repetitious for you, but I've cut out some of them. But I can't help thinking and saying that I guess all of us are characters, if we only admitted it. And when the boys were little, when Chris and Buzz first came up here, we used to sit at the supper table at night once in a while and start way down in our minds at the end of Argentine Street and assess the people in the houses all the way up. We knew them all. It was that size town. And there was a character in every one of them. And especially when we got to Chandler house, there were 3 of them. But I've often wondered, we used to ask each other if you had to be a character in order to move here, or if you became one after you were here. And I still don't know what the answer is. Let's see here what I've got to say. I think I'm going to cut out a little bit of this. Before we start on the characters, I'd like to mention a few little vignettes about our lovely little town here that always give me pleasure to remember. One of them is when the train used to come up regularly. I'm talking about the mid-1920s now, long time ago. And the train was a very viable business. They did lots of business, freight, passengers, and they came up at 6 o'clock every night down there at the depot, which is now the depot still, I guess, or gone back to being the depot. But it was quite a social hour for the town. You know, there was very little to do here in the mid-1920s. Not many people had cars, no radios even. I can remember my brother George sitting at a little crystal set with earphones on, you know, not regular radios, no television, and going down to meet the train was quite an occasion. And I can picture it, I wish you would picture it with me, on a snowy December night, about 6 o'clock, of course it's dark already, and here comes the train chugging up there, making all those beautiful noises that trains make and tooting the horn bodaciously, you know, they wanted to do that. Steam coming out of the chimneys, the pipes, whatever. And the snow-covered cars, snow-covered train, and that big white light in the front glaring out and the snowflakes falling in front of it. It was quite a pretty sight with the mountains on either side. It's something you don't forget once you've seen it. And that train precipitated more social doings in the evening. it brought up the papers, the daily papers. It brought up the Denver Post, the Rocky Mountain News. It also brought the mail. It came up at 6 o'clock every night. And so after people had met the train, we would all troop uptown to the post office to wait while the mail was being distributed so we could get our mail. And I especially remember Mr. Seifert. I think some of you will know that name. He built and lived in the house where the Moores live now. And he was the president of the bank. And he used to go down every night, that it was Clement, I suppose, and he always walked down past our house with a cane. And I used to wonder why he carried a cane, because he wasn't limping, he didn't need a cane, but he had this nice cane with him. And I learned later when I was, Clay Hutchinson, who was the original president of the bank over here, asked me to dig up some information for their opening banquet, find out what I could about the bank, and that Mr. Seifert had a dagger or a knife of some kind impaled in the bottom of this cane, and I suppose there was a little gadget on the top of it that he could have activated it with if he had needed it. So that was, he went down to get bank documents and perhaps even money. I don't know how they transferred money in those days, but I presume he had to have some cash at the bank every day, and it might have come up. So he went down well prepared. Let me see what else I wanted to remind you to not forget. Louis Dupuis, speaking of the train, this has nothing to do with what I was just saying, but to show you how casual and easygoing everything was in those days. One night, a gentleman came up and rented a room for 3 nights over at the Hotel de Paris, and Louis loved that. Louis Dupuis was a highly educated and trained man, well-read man. He read everything, subscribed to everything. And he didn't welcome women at the hotel, which was not very French of him. But if a woman insisted on coming or accompanying her husband, he usually turned her over to Sophie Galley, and that was the end of her. She didn't get to go in the sitting room and have wine and things. But he would entertain his friends until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, sit there talking. He was so hungry for company and literacy, and of course there were both here, but the majority of the people were working people and not acquainted with the French language and so on. And one morning he got a telephone call, and this guest who had come for 3 nights was on the line, and he said that he had struck some silver up here, and he had left a roll of bills in the corner of his bureau, $12,000 wadded up with a rubber band around them. And would Louis take them down and give them to the conductor? And he'd be down there to meet the train, get them from the conductor. And they both did what they said they would, and the whole thing was closed. You know, you didn't have to go get a permit or get identified or anything. It would be nice if things were a little simpler now, wouldn't it? Oh, I wanted to tell you about the post office. We all trooped up there winter and summer because it was the only social occasion of the week, usually, aside from church. And the post office was where we have the bookstore now. That was the post office. It's always nice and cozy and warm with all those big windows and the sun coming in. And I hope I'm not going to forget what I was going to tell you. Oh, when the mail came in, the postmistresses, or postmaster, which case may be, would close the windows. You know, those little barred windows that they have in banks and post offices and things are used to. They're getting away from that now. But they would close them, and that meant that there was to be no business transacted until the mail was delivered. And twice every year, I would be totally overcome with terrible embarrassment, as I am right now. I have to speak to Bill about this. He tricked me. you. But my father raised chickens, and he would order a box of 50 little baby chicks from someplace in Missouri, I don't know where, and they came up on the train. And my goodness, you can't imagine the shrieking and clucking and chirping that 50 little baby chickens can make in the post office. And of course, all the kids in school were teasing me and pointing at me, and I was praying for it to be over, but I had to stay because you couldn't get your chickens until everybody else had gotten their packages and were delivered, because the postmistress had to open the box and count them. And if any of them had died on the trip, somebody made it good. I don't know how that happened, but you just couldn't say, "Give me my box of chickens and let me get out of here." You had to stay and face it. So it was quite an ordeal for me. I was a very shy little girl. I was only about 7 when we came out here from Virginia, and I wasn't welcomed heartily, I don't think, by the other children in town. I was a scrawny little freckle-faced thing, and I talked with this southern accent, and they teased me to death and made fun of me, and I was not the most popular girl in town, and so it made me even more shy. What here was I going to tell you? I didn't play with dolls, and I didn't have many friends. I had 2 good friends here in school, and they're still my friends, but I wasn't part of the crowd. And I used to spend my time, my major interest then as now, was the outdoors and books and my dogs. And after school, I'd climb the mountains. I don't think there's a trail around here that I haven't been on at one time or another. And that was the way I spent my time. And the other way was I used to call on all the old bachelors around here. And I don't know why they were so gracious to me. I think everybody was lonesome. But about every week or so, I'd make the rounds. And there were so many people here living alone then. Men living by themselves, and a lot of women, too, living alone here. And one of them I would call on as Wing Wah. He was a Chinaman. And I don't know if he was left over from the railroad work or what, but he did laundry. And I used to stop by his little shack. He had a little brown board shack over on Argentine Street. And go in and watch him do the laundry. And I loved to go in because there was the most peculiar smell about the place. It wasn't unpleasant, it was quite attractive, but it was unidentifiable to me. Probably something that he cooked with or used in his laundry or something. But he would talk with me. Of course, I couldn't understand 3/4 of what he said, but we managed to get along with each other. And I want to tell you that he did not spit water between his teeth to dampen the clothes the way it was rumored that he did. He used these old flat irons that he kept on the kitchen stove, and you'd take, when one would get cold, you'd unhook the handle to it and put it on the stove and get another hot one, and that was how he did all his laundry. My 2 brothers built the first inn up on Berthoud Pass, and so we had laundry every week, and it was my job to take it over to him and pick it up when it was done, and I guess that's how I started calling on poor Wing Wah. Billy Gibson was another one of the old bachelors, and I say old, I noticed myself when I was making these notes, they all seemed old to me. When you're 7, you know, they were probably 35 or something. But I remember them as being old people. And Billy Gibson, though, really was old. He was an old, grizzled, old gentleman who lived alone over there in another one of those little cold shacks where the wind came through the boards all winter. And I used to go see him, and one day he became ill, and the county health department took him down to Denver to the Colorado General Hospital, which was the free hospital. And they cleaned him all up, gave him a nice warm bath, and put him to bed. And Billy died the next day. And of course, the joke then around Georgetown was that they gave Billy a bath and it killed him. I used to go see Mr. Maxwell, who of the Maxwell House up there. And unfortunately, I had no, well, on any of these visits, I didn't have any aspirations about writing then, or it makes me hate myself to think of all the stories I could have jotted down or the stories that I missed, because they were all very anxious to talk. I really think all of these older people, 35, lived alone, were anxious for company. And they were very nice to me and welcomed me. I was thinking recently that it's a good thing they didn't have the social services up here then that they do now, because some poor old men would probably be collared and marched off to jail. You know, what are you doing, that little girl over in your house all afternoon? All my fault. But I don't think it would work today if that were the case. But Mr. Maxwell was a very dignified, very admirable gentleman, and he was old. I remember he had a white beard, and the last few times I went to see him, he was sitting in one of those deep plush chairs that they used, and had a very swollen leg up on an ottoman, and I don't know if he had gout or if he had injured himself or what, but that was one of my last visits with him too. He too died shortly after that. And then there was Charlie Johnson. There were several Charlie Johnsons up here then. This was a Scandinavian community, all sorts of Johnsons and Andersons and so on. And Charlie Johnson worked over at the power plant, which is now the Energy Museum. And I used to stop in there on my rounds, and the racket in there would do you in. These huge, huge machines all in this one room. I don't know what you call them, dynamos or what, but there was this awful noise going on all the time. You couldn't hear anyone. When you went in the front doors of the power plant, you couldn't hear what anyone was saying to you. But Mr. Johnson and John Keating and some of the other men who worked there would open the door to the little office, which was right up in the front and enclosed in glass, because it was supervised 24 hours a day. They worked in 8-hour shifts, and it was never left alone. And they'd take me in there and close the door, and then you could understand how they could stand it all day, because you couldn't hear all that racket. It was just sort of a dim noise then. But that was an interesting stop for me. And there was another Charlie Johnson who was a cobbler, and he was from Sweden, spoke with quite a Swedish accent. And I used to stop in his shoe shop. It was over on 6th Street, just about where Shop International is located now. It might even have been part of that area then. But he had his little cobbler's bench and his, the tools, his awl and his glue and his nails, and he had a little shelf up there that always had maybe sometimes a new pair of shoes he had made for somebody, or a pair that had just been half soled or put a heel on, and he liked to talk too, and it was fun to watch him work on those shoes. So I didn't have a finishing school education, but I had a broad education. And it was my good fortune that everyone was so nice. It's a different world now. But the people still seem to be gracious, friendly in Georgetown. I'm so glad of that. That hasn't changed much. I think a little girl who knocked at the door, maybe if she was being a nuisance or not, might be welcomed and asked in and sat down. I don't know if all of you know, I hope I'm not telling you some things that you already know, that we used to have a beautiful opera house here. It was down right across from Leroy Buckley's garage, right where his house is now. And it was the nicest thing. I wish it were still here. It was big. It had a nice big kitchen, had a dining room where you could have dinners, nice long tables with white cloths. But the main thing it had was a beautiful dance floor. Something like this, only, I hate to tell you, more beautiful. It rivaled the one at Elitch's. It was honey-colored, and it was just waxed to a fare-you-well, especially before every dance. They would wax it, and you'd have to watch yourself for the first few dances, and you'd break your neck. But all of the Georgetown entertainments were held there. The high school graduation, and the firemen had a ball every year, and we had bands that came up from Denver. There was a stage up above the dance floor, and people would come even from as far as Central City, everybody from Idaho Springs. There just wasn't that much to choose from. And from the Buckley brothers from Silver Plume came en masse, and they were all so nice. They always asked everybody to dance. There wasn't so much couples. The men would line up over here, and the school kids and the grown women over here, and all ages over there. And these dances went on until 12 or 1 o'clock in the morning, but they always asked. I remember I was always invited to dance by one of the 9 Buckley brothers. I think by all of them before the evening was over, and so were the other young children. It was that kind of a place. I wish we still had that building. It would sure come in handy now. We need to have a dance now and then, don't we?
Was it bigger than this?
Holly, was it bigger than this room?
I beg your pardon?
Was it bigger than this?
Yes. I think the dance hall itself was probably about half again as large. And then it had a kitchen with the old cook stoves and a dining room. And there were some very nice entertainments held there. I still remember them. And people used to come from a long way to attend. Some people would come from Denver.
And then what happened to the building?
I don't know. It was torn down after I left here to go away to college. And it was during, this was all during, everything I'm talking about right now is during the Depression. And you know, that's when they took the railroad out because they couldn't pay the taxes. And as long as the ties were still there, they had to pay taxes. So they had to take the ties and the rails out in order to get away from all those thousands of dollars of taxes every year. And I don't know what the Georgetown Council, what brought them to that conclusion. I wish I did, but it was sold and torn down. I think a lot of the lumber was resold and so on, but when I came back it wasn't here. There was a lady named Mattie Oakland, and she also was a Swedish lady, and I'm sure I thought she was quite ancient, and I'm sure she wasn't, but she was taught over at the school where Mr. Buckley's schoolhouse is. And in those days you had 3 classes in each room, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade. And I was just starting 1st grade then. We had owned our home in Denver, and Buzz had gone to school in Denver for a couple of years, but Chris was just starting. And I think that I've been singled out for having lovely things happen to me because Mattie Oakland was my teacher, and she certainly had that class under nice control. None of us felt battered or threatened, but you behaved yourself. And if she was teaching the 1st grade the alphabet and some kid over in the 3rd grade tried to start a rumpus, all she had to do was stop and just look at them, and it quieted down right away. There was no need for a yardstick or anything. But when I say how lucky I've been, when I moved back up here from Denver after I had my 2 sons and decided to make Georgetown my home again because we had our house, and lo and behold, Chris entered the 1st grade, and who was his teacher but Mattie Oakland? One of those things had happened that just happened. The school board had hired all their teachers for the year, and this one young lady had signed up for these first 3 grades and then broken her contract at the last minute. and there was no teacher, and the school board approached Maddie and asked her if she'd come back. She came back for a few months, and Chris got started out in the right way. Speaking of school, I wasn't going to include this, but quite by accident, I was talking to the physical therapist who's tried to help me get back on my feet. And I guess we were talking about walking, the benefits, because I think you'd be interested to know that in those days, that was, let's see, well, that would be when I was in high school, so this would be before I had come back to live. But the Silver Plume School didn't have a high school. They had the elementary grades, and the high school kids came down to Georgetown to go to for their 4 years of high school. And I was telling this man that they walked down in the morning in a clump, and they walked back after school, year round. I mean, winter, spring, fall, they walked. And the interesting thing was that 2 of them were on crutches. 2 of the young boys or young men were on crutches. And they came right along with everybody else, swinging along on their crutches. He couldn't believe it. I think he thought I was trying to kid him, but when I told him their names, Phil Sebelius and Gary, who was...
I've heard this story and I don't remember.
I wrote it down and then I didn't. But anyway, and what made the whole thing come up, I was noticing this physical therapist's great big biceps and his shoulders, you know, and it made me think of those 2 boys on crutches, because they certainly weren't handicapped. They were the specimens of whatever you wanted, and they were so good-natured. They were good to all the little kids. They gave all of us, I was one of the small ones, and they'd push the little kids in the swings at recess and do all of the activities that everybody else did. But I wonder if our young people up at school know that a lot of them walk down from Plume every day and walk back. Once in a while in the winter, if it was bitterly cold or we had a big blizzard or something, one of the Buckley brothers would come down with a truck and give them a ride home so that they wouldn't have to come home in the dark and the snow. But it's fun to think back on. My 2 brothers owned the building where the Ram is now. And of course there was nothing in Georgetown but mining and the grocery store and maybe, I don't know, a few little places, but there was no other industry. And my brothers were unable to work by that time. And we had the confectionery, which was the part of the Ram that opens out on Rose Street, used to be the dining room, and the part that is the bar and so on now was the billiard room. We had billiard tables and card tables, and my brothers had to work quite long hours. Some of the men who came to play cards at night wanted to play till 1 or 2 o'clock, and so I would come by after school and take over the store and the pool room until 6 o'clock, and then they'd come and let me go home. And so I learned how to rack up the pool balls in the little V-shaped things real rapidly, and what order they should be in, and how to chalk the cues, you know, and get everything ready and collect the money. And so I don't know, I can't believe it sometimes. We had no freezers then, and someone else was quite aghast when I told them that we used to get the ice. We'd go up to, for the confectionery, for the cold Cokes and cold drinks and things, go up to Green Lake in the winter with our old Ford truck. Had a Ruxtell gear. If anybody knows what a Ruxtell gear is, that's what I learned to drive. So I think I'm older than any of you. It's probably the same thing as the 4th gear that you can put a Jeep in, and you can see I don't know the terminology. But they'd get a bunch of young fellows and go up there with great big saws and saw out huge chunks of that beautiful greenish blue ice that was up there, and bring it down in a truck and bring it into the billiard part of the store. And there was a big trap door there and sort of a ramp, and they'd slide the big chunks of ice down that on a burlap sack, and then we'd cover it well with sawdust, and it would last all summer. It was quite amazing. No freezers. Am I forgetting anything that might be of interest to you? We also had a mortuary here for a short time. It wasn't here for very long. But it was on 6th Street, right across from Nigel and Anderson's. And they had the mortician's name was Mr. Mitchell. And they had if the word is not too inappropriate, the prettiest little hearse. It was a carriage with 4 big wheels on it. It's drawn by 2 horses. And glass on 3 sides, the 2 sides in the end. It was etched with flowers and ferns and I guess things like Jack Frost would do or something. But it was much more charming than contemporary hearses, I think. I don't know. But I have to tell you about Mr. Mitchell. He was the undertaker, and he was a very nice man. But he did love to drink, and it was very hard to ever find him when he wasn't quite happy, and life was a bowl of cherries. And he was also an excellent baseball player, and we had our baseball teams. And of course our most fierce competitors were Silver Plume, because the Buckley boys had their own team. They had 9 young men. And they were all Irish, and believe me, you minded your P's and Q's. And Idaho Springs used to come up and play, and I don't remember who else, but the games were just fiercely contested. We'd all divide into 2 camps, those who were for Silver Plume and those who were for Georgetown, and call the umpire terrible names, even though he was a good friend of ours, and call them all, you can't play ball, why don't you go home? It was just that kind of a small town thing. But one day there was something very close, and they asked Mr. Mitchell to pinch hit, because he could always hit. He never missed. And he had been on the team regularly for quite a while, but I think he was having a little layover that day or something. But he came up, and the score was tied. And Billy Mitchell hit. And did he ever hit? That ball went up to where Peter Worland's house is now. He hit it. Really, it was a double home run, if there's such a thing. And everybody was yelling, and the Silver Plume team was broken down, and we were screaming and cheering. And lo and behold, Mr. Mitchell ran the bases in the wrong direction. He went over to third base, and then he went to second, and then he came home, and that was a triumphant day for him, because he didn't know that he'd ruined the whole thing. He'd hit that home run, and he'd showed them that he could still hit. And Plume won the game. Let me see what else I want to tell you. I suppose you all know this is nothing new, that the mines up here all blew their steam whistles whenever there was an accident in the mine. And they all blew them at 4:30 when the mines closed. Now I'm back to when I was 7 or in the early 20s. And if you heard that whistle blow at any time other than 4:30, it was blood-curdling, because you knew there had been a mine accident, and all the wives had come running down the street in their aprons. And I remember the Capitol Prize was one that was still working, and also its mill. There were 2 or 3 other good-sized mines working in the area then, and that was a terrible sound to hear that whistle blow. I guess we better come to the characters now. When I think of characters, one of the first things I think of is our choir at the Presbyterian Church. I'm an Episcopalian, but in those days, and still, the Episcopalians are the minor number. There are very few Episcopalian families here, and then there were perhaps 2 or 3. They couldn't afford to keep a pastor up here over the winter, and we had services all summer, but we all went to the Presbyterian Church, to Sunday school, and to church too. And the group that we had assembled for choir, they were wonderful. They were so full of horseplay and doing tricks on each other and everything. And the choir practice on Thursday night was something you didn't want to miss. And Ona Anderson, who was a wonderful musician, she would put up with us, and she taught us the anthems that we sang every Sunday right after the prayer and so on. And she'd let this go on for a certain length of time, and then she'd tap the piano with a little stick, and that meant it was time to call it quits. But I'll always remember, when I say I sang in the Presbyterian choir, it's not accurate. I didn't have any voice to speak of at all. It was true, but it didn't have any power. You couldn't hear me 3 feet away. But I think it was nice to have another person sitting in the chair up there in the choir. It made it look like we had a bigger choir than we did. But I can hear, we sopranos sat in the front, and right behind me were the altos, and this dear little woman from Switzerland was an alto, and I can hear her singing, "In all we shall prevail." And then Stig was back in the last row from Stockholm, and he would be singing about "Come to the church in the wildwood," you know. It was a very interesting choir. At one time, I don't know who came up with this notion, but we went to Idaho Springs at Easter and Christmas to sing, and they came up here. And that didn't last very long, because that took up most of Easter Day for both of them to go back and forth. But the priest at the Catholic Church, Father Joe Bartos, a lot of you know him, wonderful man. And he had a beautiful voice, and their service was earlier than ours, so he'd slip out of his robe and come over to our church and put on a choir robe and sing with our choir. And some of the people at the Catholic Church just didn't like that a bit. And I remember one lady saying to me, "I wish those Presbyterians would stay on their own side of the creek," because you know, the creek divides the 2 churches. All we shall prevail. There was a fellow named Bill Lang who sang in the choir, and he was another bachelor who lived alone. He was just a little short man, and he was very correct and precise about everything. And he always wore a 3-piece wool suit. Didn't matter whether it was, I'd see him walking through the park in July, and he'd have his vest buttoned, you know, from top to bottom. I wondered how he stood it. But he loved music. He just loved music. And Ona would play the offertory while the ushers were taking up the collection. And we all sat up there and behaved ourselves. But Bill, he'd hum with whatever hymn she was playing. And sometimes he'd get carried away and hum pretty loudly, and you'd see the people in the congregation, we all knew him and it was all right. But once or twice he even burst out into song. He just couldn't resist it. He couldn't help it. Bill, I remember Bill particularly for his Christmas spirit. The only thing he did to make any concession to Christmas decorating. In Georgetown would be all decorated up with our tree uptown and everything. And Bill, 2 weeks before Christmas, would unscrew the bulb on his front porch and replace it with a green bulb. And on New Year's Day, he took it out and put the white one back. And that was his Christmas celebration, his Christmas. But all such nice people. Something a little poignant here now. There were a couple of bachelors again, a couple of men who lived together up at the far end of town, and they had a little mining claim down below Georgetown, somewhere in the nature of where the dam is now, but across on the mountain. And they had this little burrow, and of course all the traffic went up and down Rose Street in front of our house. And I would see them going down in the morning, one on each side of the little donkey, walking down to their mine. At 4:30, they'd walk past the house, coming back up, and going home. And one day they had an accident down there, and one of the two men was killed. He was impaled under a huge rock, and nobody could get him out. And that evening, the other little partner came walking up past our house with just by himself, so looked little and lonely, and leading his little donkey. And those are things that you remember for many, many years. And the other thing that may be a little poignant to you, but I have to mention it because I was one of his admirers. I think enough of you are still here who remember Doug Marshall. Remember Doug? He used to work over at the public service too, and he was one of the people I would call on. But Doug was totally devoted to his mother. He just was totally devoted to her. And there were 5 children, the 3 boys and the 2 girls. And one time his mother got ill. The children were still all small. And they took her to Denver to the hospital, and she died. She had a goiter. And it made me remember so many people up here had goiters then. Some of you folks must know the reason. I think I've been told, but I don't know what it is. But that night, the beautiful little hearse, it was in real ebony black, shiny and beautiful, and then the etched glass, and it went down to meet the train at 6 o'clock and get her coffin off the train. And for some reason, I wasn't a participant that night. I wasn't down there. I remember my mother and I watching as he came up the street with this little hearse, and they hadn't pulled the curtains up. They had those little fringed white curtains that they could pull up or down, but you could see the coffin. And Doug was walking along beside the horse's head with his head bowed down, and in this hand he had his hat, and he had the horse's bridle up here, and he walked all the way up to the little mortuary with his mother's body. And that was a very poignant thing because he was one broken up man, and his courtesy prevailed. He and Mr. Pilch used to mine together up in the Argentine, and Doug was the kind of man who would never think of talking to a woman with his hat on. I think I once heard one of our comedians say that the definition of a gentleman is somebody who never hit a woman with his hat on, but Doug wouldn't talk to one with his hat on. He'd hold his hat in his hand. And Mr. Pilch used to tease him so because lots of tourists went up there all summer and the fall. They were all curious about the mining operation, and the area was so beautiful. And if there was any woman in the party who wanted to see the Santiago mine, Doug would take his hat off and talk to them, and they were willing to stay there quite a long time. And Mr. Pilch used to say, Doug, you better put your cap back on, your head's going to get sunburned. You better not be so polite. I saved the best till last. At least it's my favorite. We had a marshal in Georgetown. His name was B.L. Sentai. And everybody from the toddlers to the grandparents called him BL, but I, being born in Virginia, called everybody Mr., so he was always Mr. Sentai to me, as Mr. Piltz was always Mr. Piltz. And talk about a town marshal. Mr. Sentai cleared the roads there was only one, cleared the roads of snow in the winter. He graded the streets in the summer. He mowed the city park and Strauss Park. He was the policeman. And if anybody wanted their water turned on or off, Mr. Sentai did it. He was everything. Sometimes in the winter time, which has been happening all too frequently, but not as much as usual, thank goodness, one of the big water mains would freeze. And Mr. Sentai would try to get somebody to help him, usually Muck's Richwine. And they'd dig up the street. You'd be down there, you could hardly see the top of their heads. But he did it all. We need a marshal like that, don't we? And not only that, after dinner, then he would come uptown, he'd clean up and come up and stroll around and be sure that, especially in the summer, that everything was all right at the pool hall and the stores were locked and so on. But one day, it was in July, and Chris and Ronnie Lane, you all know Ronnie, were very good friends. They played together. They were 6 or 7 years old. And they came and asked me if they could put on their swimming trunks and go play in the hose in the park. And I said, yes, that seems all right. You get Mr. Sentai's permission and be sure before you do it. And so they did, and they were over there having a jolly time. And there was one of those ladies in town that perhaps every small town has, but there wasn't any business that wasn't her business. It didn't matter whether she was on a committee or in charge of anything, she was there. And she came down the street, and oh goodness, she laid the boys out. You ought to be ashamed. You're ruining that grass. You should know better than that, and you go home right now. So they came over to the house all crestfallen and long-faced and told me this story, and I said, well, it's just about noon. You could almost set your clock by Mr. Sentai's coming home for lunch. He came home at noon, and the whistle would blow, and Mr. Sentai's old rattle-trap truck would come down the street. You could hear it 2 or 3 blocks away. It was a nice new truck. And I said, he'll be down there in a minute. We'll walk on down and ask him what you should do. So he pulled up just about the time we got in front of his house. He lived in the house that was now the 1021 Rose Street restaurant. And the boys told him their sad tale. And they were 6 or 7 devout Boy Scouts or Cub Scouts. And Mr. Sentai listened to them. He didn't say one word. He just stood there and listened, didn't interrupt them. And I think he should have been an actor because he knew all about pregnant pauses. Even when they were finished, he didn't say anything. He stood there looking at them for a while. And so one of them said, oh, what should we do, Mr. Sentai? And he said, tell her to go to hell. Their eyes bugged out. They were looking at me, and Ronnie said, should we, Mrs. Chandler? And Chris said, would that be all right, Mom? You could tell they were kind of taken with the idea, even if they weren't going to be scouts. But I was trying to smooth things over, and I said, well, no, of course not, boys. That isn't what Mr. Sentai means. I said, what he means is that you should tell her that you had permission and so on. And Mr. Sentai was standing there leaning against the truck listening to all of this, and he got tired of listening. I guess he wanted his lunch, so he interrupted me, and he fixed me with his eye, not the boys. And he says, no, Polly, that isn't what I mean at all. I mean, tell her to go to hell. Left me in an odd position, to say the least. But that's it. That's all I'm going to tell you. There are many, many more stories, but that's enough for one night. I picked out the ones I thought you might like best.
Chloe, wouldn't you read from your book?
Well, Mr. Wilson wanted me to read from my book, and I really am reluctant to do that. He wanted us to bring books here for you to see and so on, and I didn't. It seems like I'm saying, please buy my book, or you're my captive audience and you should. But if he said, you've always told me October's your favorite month, read a little bit from the October chapter. So if you want me to do that, I will, but you don't have to sit through it. I don't know which I liked least. Is this or reading from my book? I've been betrayed. October is lovely up here, isn't it? This chapter is October, when solitude is magic. And this is from the We'll Be Back Tomorrow. There's a little booklet about Mr. Piltz. I wanted very much to talk about Mr. Piltz tonight because he was one of the characters and one of the wonderful ones. But hasn't been long enough since he died. I don't think I can. We were all so fond of him. And I think many of you know about him anyway. So maybe he'll be in another talk sometime. October is my undoing. Each year it is the same. Through all the other beautiful months, each one singing its own siren song, I can somehow manage to make myself bend to my tasks. Not in October. In spite of previous resolutions, duties are glossed over, dusting is ignored entirely. The outdoors calls irresistibly, and responsibility rests lightly on me. Where was I? Shouldn't look up. Not a minute of the golden days can be spared with grace. Like a squirrel hoarding nuts and seeds for the winter, I hoard to hold against the cold days ahead, that special touch of the warm October sun. The sky is the color of a stellar jay's wing, and bluer than ever with the gold treetops against it. One feels a twinge of poignancy at the sight of that last splurge of color. It is as if the flowers know too that they won't be long and are racing against time. But the poignancy is only because of the growing things. Fall is not a melancholy time to me that a few of the poets would have us think it was. I like Edna St. Vincent Millay's lines. O world, I cannot hold thee close enough, you all know that. Thy winds, thy wide gray skies, thy mists that roll and rise. Fall is my new year, much more than January. Plans fill my head. It is the time when family and friends draw close together as the dusk closes in earlier. When red apples in wooden bowls and popcorn, reading cherished books aloud are permissible dreams. Golden days and deep blue nights and long walks through rustling dry leaves. When one is little and coming home from just before dark, those rustling leaves can produce that little thrill of fear, half pleasant and half scary, that one is being followed and not all those rustling steps are yours. How many times I have quickened my pace as I neared home on a shadowy moonlit evening, hurrying faster, faster, wanting but not daring to look back over my shoulder. Opening the back door to see Mother at the warm kitchen was a joyful relief that more practical children never experienced. But autumn is not to be spent in past dreams. It is for present dreams and future ones. Nature, ending one cycle, but already laying plans and dropping seeds for another one, tells us something that is good to know. Up high where the nights are coldest, the golden color starts first. We step to the back door every morning as soon as the coffee is put on to perk and look up to see how much the color has progressed during the night. It is an emphatic way to start the day, for nature is not indecisive in the fall as she is in April. The shimmering gold and yellow of aspen leaves works down toward our valley a little further each day. This season is not just for admiring things. We dig the potatoes, sifting through the rich black soil for the rosy-skinned nuggets that will taste so good when the snow falls, and so different from market potatoes. And then some late afternoon, dark clouds will start to drift over the mountains. The temperature will drop quickly. A cold wind will send the leaves down from the trees in a twirling ballet of incomparable grace. We put on sweaters and gloves and scurry about, potting the last glowing geraniums from the window boxes, harvesting the last of the vegetable garden, cutting every flower left and putting them in pails of cool water, trying to hoard the last bit of summer's and autumn's beauty. Even if it were not my own heart's desire, Lum does not let me forget that it is walking weather and the day is passing. He is not reticent about urging. Expectant brown eyes follow my every move. Superlative acting and timing. A deep sigh, an occasional groan indicate that he is in great misery, even pain. Black Labradors groan well when the situation calls for it. In October, every walk for which we can steal time is squeezed in, be it short or all day long. There is so much to see, so much that is sheer wonder and awe. Our favorite paths are fragrant with that rich scent that comes only from hot sun on fallen leaves and mushrooms. Have the mushrooms thrown their spores, we wonder, as they are reputed to do? Here's one that hasn't. Ivory-colored, miraculous in construction. It grows against a rock that is warm from the sun. It appears not to have been above ground too long and has some damp soil on its head. Along the trail to the ponds, the bushes that had delicate pink roses on them in June have changed their trimming to match the season. Where was I? I shouldn't have gone. Lum's black coat glistens too as he swims across the other side, across to the other side, only to come back and do it again. This is more like it, he indicates. We can stay home and write letters and pay bills another time. I miss Jocko keenly. He was gentle and joyful, part of so many of our autumns. 15 years leave their mark on your heart. I think Lum misses him too. It's not as much fun to dig alone, and a companion to swim with, each trying to retrieve the same stick, is exciting. There are human losses again this year too, one especially beloved in my heart. If we can only remember, grasp each day and each season as it comes, for it is unique. There will never be another day exactly like this one. We cook our supper and stay late, much later than we should. The mountains become storybook mountains, deep blue, smoky and mysterious. The trail is dark and shadowy as we come down, and small birds that have settled in the low bushes for the night fly upward with sweet twitterings, black silhouettes against the luminous sky. It is chilly, and in the morning the leaves lying on the path like golden coins will each be rimmed with silver frost. When we unlatch our gate, the moon, a silver crescent, is just above the mountain.
To answer questions,
If I can hear them, you'll have to read
I'll
it.
speak to them. Polly has said she would answer questions if you have any, as long as you speak up, or I can forward.
I said if he would relay them. After all these years, as I told you, I'm getting some hearing aids and they're down being altered. And I'll have, maybe Mr. Wilson will have to tell me what you're saying. I don't know. I don't know if you have any questions that I can answer.
I have one. Would you please do this again someday in the near future?
Nice of you. Well, if you have any,
Polly,
yes.
in that story you just read, which trail were you talking about? Where were the ponds?
It's the beaver ponds where we spent most of the boys' childhood and most of my time after the boys had married and left home is the one you turn off Guanella Pass. And I think most of you know about it. And I'll tell you something bad about me. I was kind of cross when I found out that everybody in the county was going up there to ski and have parties and things. That's our trail and our beaver ponds. And if they'd only clean up after themselves, I got over being cross. But you turn off Guanella Pass just above the dam. There's a little road that runs down, and it's
we
hard
call
on your tires.
Silverdale.
Is that what you, well, Silverdale is on down at the other end of the dam, but you
that
have to go
area.
that way to get there. But this one goes on up, and it comes to a juncture, about how many yards would you say, Chris? And where you turn up to the right, you can go to the beaver ponds, and if you turn left, you come to that old cement mill that has the beautiful view down there. And we've just spent hours up there. We've walked that trail when it was snowing so hard that you couldn't see the person in front of you. But the weather never did make any difference. It's beautiful in all seasons.
Polly, we clean up trash up there now.
Excuse me?
I said, we clean trash up there now, so you don't have to worry about it.
All right, thank you. And you're making people clean up their eggshells and their bean cans and things. That's sacrilege.
But we always take a sack.
And I know that none of our local people would do that. I think everybody loves our town. I want to ask you something, since you've given me a moment here, and perhaps I shouldn't, but I do see new faces here. And I want to ask you all if you won't involve yourself in Georgetown and what we're trying to save here. We're not Williamsburg. We're a little, lovely little mountain town, beautiful scenery, but with an entirely different framework and everything. And I keep hearing, and I'm sure you do too, that there are things in the making that we want to be careful of. I hope that you will go to some of the council meetings. Something was passed a couple of weeks ago, I believe, that I'm heartily against. And it was my own fault. I wasn't there. And you can't complain all the time and not go to the meetings. I'm going to complain still because I'm lucky enough to be a citizen of the United States and I have the right. But as my mother would say, it's more luck than good management, because you need to be there. And I hope you'll all take an interest, because we need everybody in town pulling together to keep it nice. We don't want it turned into anything but Georgetown. And I don't mean we don't want any progress, of course we do, but there can be progress with grace and dignity, and that's what we'd like to see.
Do you want to sit down, Polly? Polly, do you want to
Pardon?
sit? Do you want to sit?
No, I don't think so. I'm going home.
Thank you all for coming. Let's all go home.
That was so wonderful. You really should do something like this every week. I think people just absorb and love this. Do you need any help getting your things out?
Polly,
Down there.
Okay, I'll go grab
that
them
was
for you.
wonderful.
Thank
One
you.
of
I don't think
the,
it
that was
was,
one
but
of the
I got
best.
through it.
Oh, that was wonderful.
And Chris has our books back there if anybody wants them.
Okay.
You know where the store is.
Sure do.
I loved it.
Oh,
Every time I read your book, I start to cry. So of course I have to. Well, I just love it. It just means a lot.
even when you read it, she cries.
I told her that her book was one of the reasons I moved to Georgetown.
Absolutely, yeah,
Really
absolutely.
influenced my choice.
It's just
Beautiful.
When you said you were going to talk about characters, I thought you were going to talk about my father, Marcellus Merrill.
I'd like to have.
I would be
Someday.
ashamed.
I have letters from him.
But don't throw them away.
Oh, don't think I will.
Yeah, but he was one of the characters.
Oh, he was good. And your mother. She was a lovely lady.
Hi, I'm Ron Belak. Ron Belak.
Katie, glad to Yes.
Sure. You probably spent quite a bit of time on Grinnell Pass early on. How long do you remember people actually going up to the lakes up there, like Square Top and Naylor, and actually catching fish?